So the course case of the cordwainers in Philadelphia, the Journeymen cordwainers, or the Commonwealth versus Polis, is one of the earliest labor disputes in American history. Not the earliest, because that goes back to 1619, where Polish glassmakers were brought to the um, the settlement of Jamestown for their glassmaking artisan skills. But they went on strike and had a dispute with the settlers of Jamestown over lack of representation and their unfair treatment. Uh, but the dispute in Philadelphia with the cordwainers has to do with how things played out later on in the 19th century. Now, what is it, cordwainers? Cordwainers basically were people who made shoes. So at this time, we're not talking about mass production factories and things like that. These are artisans. So a master was somebody who owned their own shop. If you were a master printer, master cordwainer, or so on, Cooper was a barrel maker, things like that. You owned your own shop and you sold the items. And then a journeyman was somebody who completed their uh, training, but was not somebody who owned their own business. And then a apprentice was somebody who's just learning the trade. Okay, and then they become a journeyman and they work for the master. So these people were people who had completed their training, but they worked for wages given by the master who owned the shops and sold the shoes. So here was what happened. So the journeymen were asked to settle for lower wages because the masters who owned the shops in Philadelphia were going to accept out of the city, out of the state contracts from mainly from the South, right? Of people buying shoes and boots and things like that. So they were able to sell them for cheaper and to undercut the competition in Baltimore. So they did this, but as more and more contracts came up, and the masters were making more money, they assumed that the wages would return to what they formerly were, and they didn't. So, in order to pressure on them, they went on strike, and they organized boycotts. This was to return the wages for these services to what they had previously been, but also demanding higher wage for custom work, right? So they were making custom boots and shoes, and they wanted to be paid more because that was more labor intensive. So what the shop owners or masters did in response was they charged them with criminal conspiracy, and they took them to court over it. So the prosecution used two things. They used the Constitution and the protection in the Constitution that it gives to private property, right? And they used British common law. And in using both of these, they argued that the journeyman organ, organizing the way they did and using strikes to demand wages was an illegal action, and it was against the private property of the masters who owned the shops and against the free market. Now, the defense argued, again, using the Constitution, the right to assemble, the right to negotiate for better working conditions, and the right to protest against exploitation. And, they also used the American Revolution that had just previously been fought, kind of, equating them with the American Revolutionary War full soldiers, and saying that they had the right, to fight against exploitation as the American revolutionaries did. Now the jury was made up mostly of masters who own their own shops, and they found the journeyman guilty. But not only that, they found that labor organizations, such as the organization that these journeymen cord swingers were in were illegal. This had a large impact on the labor movement in the early part of the 19th century because now labor organizations were illegal up until just before the American Civil War and in the 1840s. I believe in Massachusetts was the first time that they actually became legal. But not only that, but they could be sued for compensation for damages for these illegal actions in these strikes. So throughout the 19th century, this court case was used by courts later on as proof of to squash labor union rights, uh, and an organized labor to at all, to fine workers who were striking for the damages against their employers, and to reinforce employer dominance over the market and over labor. So this case, of very early on, even though it's before the industrial age, before the factories, it marks the beginning of the long struggle that workers faced, and how employers continually, time and time again, used the justice system to put down labor, and to reinforce their dominance over the economy and over the workers and their labor. So while the case of the Philadelphia cordwainers uh, was not the earliest strike, not the earliest labor action, it definitely does mark the beginning of the American labor movement. And again, not in the industrial age yet. We're talking about an artisan period against masters, and between journeymen and masters, but it definitely marks uh, the beginning of the American labor movement, and the necessity for organized labor and the struggles that they had to face against the bosses.